Good morning, everyone. So we are going to jump into a new unit. We just finished up poetry, talking about emotions and expression, and today we are going to start a literary analysis unit. Um, Not necessarily, for just, nope. Hey everyone, so today we are starting a new unit. We just wrapped up our poetry study and writing process. So we are going to be reading the book Night. I posted a little bit of an overview of the unit already. So we're just going to jump right in. Today we are going to be looking at some of the historical significance of the story, looking at some of the context, what happened in reality, and how does it connect with the book. And by the end of the session, you will end up writing a racer paragraph that points to at least two details from the story that kind of connect with an accurate historical detail. Okay. So we're going to build that background knowledge, and then you have a little bit of reading to do this week. Remember, this is weekly reading. It's not a single day. So there are 25 pages to get through. It's about 45 minutes. If you listen to the recorded version that I have provided, there are 4 videos for that and 4 or 5, and you would just listen to those. You can listen as you read, but either way, it's whatever format works best for you. So I'm going to go ahead and move this a little bit so that we can actually see the whole title. So what is the setting? For this book, we are looking at 1941 to 1944. So it is all happening within this 4-year span. A lot happens in this 4-year span because it is toward the end of World War II. So that Holocaust period. Specifically, it takes place in Hungary and Poland. Shortly before this time setting, the town that we're starting in, Sziget, Transylvania, was actually part of Romania. But then during the Hungarian expansion, Hungary kind of incorporated Sziget, and then some of our characters end up going to Poland. So that's a little bit of the basic setting for the novel. Okay. And as far as the timeline goes, this is towards the end of World War II. So this timeline shows that World War II officially started in 1939 and it went until 1945. The concentration camps that we're going to be referencing actually started going up in 1933. So there were work camps and everything established well before the start of World War II. But we're specifically looking at these 4 years from 1941 to 1944. This information here, this timeline, shows kind of a holistic view, but we're really going to be looking in at that Poland and Hungary area. So those details aren't on here, but I just wanted to show you in the broad spectrum of things, this is taking up a decent chunk of the official World War II. Okay, so who are our characters? Really, the big focus is going to be on Elie Wielsel. He is the author of the book, but he is also the narrator. So this is written from his perspective. It is written about his memories. He is a survivor of the Holocaust, so this is real. It is his history. It is classified as a fiction text because some elements were adjusted, or he tried to incorporate several aspects of the Holocaust into one character or one instance. So everything is real in the sense that it happened and is his experience, but he did end up making some modifications just so that he could incorporate a more overview of his story. And then it also includes Elie's family. So he has a dad, a mom, and 2 sisters. And then there's a variety of other characters throughout. We've got a lot of SS officers, a lot of other Jews. We have a lot of Germans that are in support of and against the Nazi party. So a lot of people do come and go, but our primary character, our protagonist, is Elie Wielsel. Okay. And a little bit of context for this. So again, I already mentioned concentration camps. Those had been installed or constructed throughout Europe. starting back in actually 1933. And 1936 is where they really started to start transporting people. And then 1939 is when the World War II officially began. So people had been imprisoned for a while. And it wasn't always Jews. It actually started out as prisoners of war, or any political opposition to the Nazi Party. So they would be thrown in prison in these concentration camps, which is why they've been around for so long. And then there's also German SS. That's how Elie refers to the officers that are kind of shuttling people around, and it's the Nazi Party enforcement. So the Nazis were actually a political party, and the German SS. So think of it as their kind of their primary like militant officers. They were the ones that gave a lot of the orders, that followed a lot of the orders to gather people up and transport them to concentration camps. So whenever he talks about German SS, he's talking about those officers. Okay. And then the Holocaust itself. This is review for several of you, but it's going to be a brief skim for those of you that don't actually know much about the Holocaust, and that's totally fine. So it is a specific element of World War II. So the war was an all-encompassing thing, and the Holocaust was kind of a very important and significant detail of the war. So the word Holocaust actually means a giant hole. And so it's this concept of, one, there's like a giant void in our society now, or two, they literally dug giant holes for bodies because there was so much death. So it is just one part of the war, but it is a huge part of that war. It was the imprisonment of anyone seen as undesirable by the Nazis from 1933 to 1942, okay, like I had said. Now, I did say that our setting was 1941 to 1944. So we do have just a little bit that happens after Elie's experience in the concentration camps, okay? And then what it really was an attempt by Germany with the support of Axis powers. So it wasn't only one country, but they were trying to wipe out all opposition and undesirable individuals. Okay, so not only people that they didn't think deserved a spot in society, but also anyone that opposed them. And this is what I mean by undesirable. All of these people, all of these classifications, all of these groups of people were targeted as undesirable by the Nazi Party, by Hitler's reign. Okay, so Jewish individuals were the biggest targeted audience, but then also Romas or Gypsies, they were seen as undesirable because they didn't lay down roots. They were transient, they moved around a lot, and they had a different style of living, so they were not seen as a desirable type of human being. The Polish, so anyone from Poland, Soviet prisoners of war. So anyone that was from Soviet Union, which we now know as Russia, if they were captured during war, they're like, nope, they were also sent to concentration camps. Anyone that was disabled, either mentally or physically, if someone was deaf, blind, wheelchair bound, they could very easily be targeted for heading to a concentration camp. Anyone deemed to be an enemy of the state. So even if there was no proof, if somebody in a high-ranking Nazi official believed or wanted others to believe that someone was an enemy of the state, they could make something up. They could have some grounded evidence, doesn't matter. They could be sent to these concentration camps if a Nazi official was like, you are not all for us. Afro-Germans, Jehovah's Witness, homosexuals, anyone that kind of broke the expected norm of the Nazi Party. So why did this all happen? Well, Hitler saw the Jewish race as the biggest threat to the German success, and he was all about German success. So anyone that was Jewish or had any traits that were not desired in like the perfect German heritage would be targeted. Okay, so he kind of wrote on this platform of it's all about Germany, and we are going to make sure that we are the strongest. And anyone that's not strong like us is going to be gone. Okay. So all of the undesirable categories that I mentioned before were targeted, but it was mostly very strong to the Jewish community. Millions of Jews were targeted and killed during this time. The imprisonment actually began in cities called ghettos. So when we talk about ghettos, most of the time today, it's like, oh, that's the rundown part of town, or that's where all the crime is. But really, ghettos started as a way of imprisoning mostly Jewish families. So people were taken out of their homes, moved into a very small part of town, and then there were giant fences and gates put around to where they couldn't leave, and Nazi guards were put on patrol. So they were literally dividing up cities, putting up walls to keep these undesirables in a small portion of town, trying to get them all confined into one area. And if people didn't go along with it, they would often be just killed or taken to prison. So this is an example of what one of those walls would look like. You can see that it literally cuts in the middle of town. We've got some trolley tracks here. So typically there would be a form of transportation that just runs down that street. But once the ghetto was put in place, no one could go beyond that wall. Okay. Here is another image. Sometimes they weren't cement walls, sometimes they were wood walls, and you can kind of see the barbed wire up at the top, trying to prevent people from getting out. And then there were signs indicating that this was a ghetto for Jewish citizens, but really they were prisoners by this point. They'd all been shuttled into a very small portion of town and crammed into other people's houses. And there were officers here. No one could get out. People could get in if they were visiting, but then once they were done visiting, they sometimes they were let out, sometimes they weren't, but they had to show proof that they were not Jewish or they did not belong in that ghetto. And then here's an example of what markets would look like in there. So because everyone was forced into a new part of town, new for most people, they still had to make a living. So a lot of people still had to kind of come up with ways of having markets so that they could still make food, they could still make money. And so they would do shops kind of like this. And this isn't uncommon in a lot of larger cities, but it was extremely cramped. And this is kind of just like a style of what we would potentially have seen back then. Okay. So once everyone was rounded up and put into ghettos, they would usually have to stay there for a little while, kind of in a level of unknown, don't know what's going to be happening next. But then they would end up getting shuttled by train cars. So these ghettos were often built fairly close to train yards, so that once the time came for them to be put into concentration or work camps, then it was very easy to just round everyone up and shuttle them to the train yard and shove them into the cars. Literally hundreds of people per train car, very little or no food or water, and it was so cramped that everyone had to stand. There was no space to sit down because people were they were getting shoved into these cars and they were getting packed as full as they could. And this is a little bit of what that process looked like. Okay, so people literally being ushered into all of these train cars. So this is one style. You can see that most people have a star, the Star of David, on their clothing. That actually became a law. They had to have that if they were Jewish, just to identify themselves as a Jew. And that was also a big visual cue where if someone saw that from a distance, they knew that it was someone that was undesirable by the state. So they were they were shuttled into these cars, and sometimes they were not as nice as that first image. Sometimes it was literally an open air train car, and it didn't matter what the weather conditions were. They would have to stand for hours. Here we can see it's sunny. Some people may say that's better than the rain, but then at the same time, if you were just standing there with hundreds of people, it's still extremely hot and extremely exhausting. So it's just a little bit of the transport process. So first they get shuttled into ghettos, then they get shuttled into the train cars, and then they are going to concentration or work camps. So these are forced labor camps. There are two different types. There's death camps and forced labor camps. The forced labor, it actually started with these prisoners of war and the political opposition, and then really kind of spread to all of the concentration camps. And the prisoners would have to build roads, build machinery, act as servants to Nazi gatherings. So they would see all of these fancy parties going on, and they were the servants. And if they acted out at all, they were either beaten or killed. They would build daily items for the German citizens, do a lot of construction. There was a lot of manual labor going on in these work camps, this forced labor. And because they didn't get much food or water most of the time, the quality of work wasn't always up to par. It wasn't always up to standards for the German officers. And so there was a lot of exhaustion and beating and a lot of just death from exhaustion. Then there was also death camps. So these were intended for mass killings. They had facilities set up. Firing squads would just line people up and shoot them. Gas chambers were constructed to where people would get shuffled into a room and then gassed to death. Often people were starved, left for dead, and she said, no, well, you didn't make it. You're not strong enough. A lot of times it was exhaustion that killed people as well. So there were specific camps that were intended for mass killings, and then there were also camps that were intended for forced labor and work. And then sometimes if there was a lull, it was just boredom, but they couldn't really go do much, right? So why are we actually talking about all of this? We're going to be reading a book. Why do we need to know all of this context? Well, just remember that this is real. So this book actually happened. This is Elie Wiesel's memoir. It is his retelling of memories and of his experience during this. So all of this provides some context for, one, why this novel was written, and two, some of the things that happen in this novel, so that we know that it wasn't just an isolated incident. This all happened, and this all happened throughout Europe. So Elie's experience is not an isolated incident. But I also want to start off with transparency. There's going to be a decent chunk of darkness in this book. There's also moments of glimmer, but a lot of kind of darkness and a lot of death and a lot of hard things. So I wanted to start off with some transparency and let you know that there's some heavy stuff, but it's real. And Elie was 13 when this book starts, so a little bit younger than most of you. So he lived this, and if we don't talk about it and we don't actually read it, then it's not honoring that experience. So we can read about it and we can talk about it because people lived it. And then also he wrote about something that he knew, like this was his reality. And if we don't read about what these people experienced, then we won't know other people's stories. And it's so important to understand and know other people's stories and not just living in our own. Okay. So that's why I wanted to cover all this background from the Holocaust, is because we are starting and the Holocaust has already begun in this book. So what we just talked about had been happening for several years. Like I said, we are picking up in 1941. So this has been going on for almost a decade, because the first one started construction in 1933. So that's the reality of it all. So what's next? All right, well, this is where you guys are going to, you can either just sit down and read, or you can break it up over the next several days. This is going to be your pacing, but you're going to read pages 3 through 28 of this version. There are several versions out there, but I have the PDF of this linked. So if you want to just open that up, or if you actually have a copy of this version, go for it. Pages 3 through 28. Now there is like a foreword and a little bit of information, so it doesn't start right at the beginning, but at the actual number 3. Okay. Or you can listen to a recorded version. So I actually started last year recording the whole book, because I read this book each year with my students. And if you would rather listen to it, you're more than welcome to. I will say that it's going to be important to reference information from the text, so make sure you are actually listening. And when we do our writing and our analysis, it will be very helpful if you have a page number. So if you follow along, that would be ideal. But read these first 25 pages and then respond to this prompt. Okay. What historical or real details did Elie Wiesel include in the beginning of this book? So in these first 25 pages, What real details did he include? We just covered all of that. Okay, so in other words, how has this story been historically accurate according to the information we just covered? Okay. So point to at least 2 details that you see in the first 25 pages. A lot of the information that we just covered is covered in these first 25 pages. So pick 2 or more that really stand out to you and explain, like, how is that actually showing the historical accuracy? Okay. Write a raised paragraph and submit it, and you're golden. Just so you know, on Thursday there will be a posting regarding kind of coming up with ideas for our own lived experiences that we may be able to share or manipulate slightly to tell a story about. Okay. I hope you enjoy this book as much as I do. I read it several times a year, and I get something new from it each time.